Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
The world learned some sad news this week. A woman who has rightly been described as America's sweetheart during the 1970s and 1980s, Olivia Newton-John, she passed away. I am really feeling old. She was in her 70s when Grease came out. Let's see, I think that was 77 or 78. I was a kid, and the movie was huge and it was fun. I mean, it was so unusual. And of course, she was just cute as a button. I mean, how could you not, fall in love with Olivia Newton-John?
Right.
And it's a weird story because this is what she was born in England, and then they moved when she was young, and she grew up in Australia, right? And she had this funky accent, but she comes over and just wins over the hearts of Americans. And she's gone. I learned some interesting things. I did not realize this about her. She has a fascinating family. Her father was a British intelligence officer during World War II. And in fact, after the war, he was one of those people who helped track down, after the war, a bunch of the leading Nazi officers, like they did what cockroaches do, right? And they just scattered.
Sure.
And I mean, they went all over the world. Like they fled to the far lengths of the world. And there were hunts to go hunt these guys down and bring them back and bring them to, put them on trial and bring them to justice. And her Olivia Newton-John's father was one of those guys helping to find Nazis around the world. And even before that, her father also, during the war, there was a small group of British intelligence agents who were cracking the Nazi codes. The Nazis had these elaborate encryption machines so they could communicate in secret. And her father was one of the guys who helped crack those codes. And so the Allied forces could figure out what the Nazis were doing and where the U-boats were and all that sort of stuff. And then her grandfather, I'm sorry, this would be her maternal grandfather, her mother's father, was a German-born Jewish physicist, the last name Born, Max Born, who was a Nobel Prize. I mean, this guy was maybe not quite Albert Einstein, but like right next to him in that circle of great minds. And he was one of those Jewish intellectuals who in the 1930s, right, could see what was going on. Thought this is bad news for us, and packed up his family and moved to England to get away from Hitler's Nazi Germany. And that's why Olivia Newton-John was born in England.
That 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon theory. I wonder how. I mean, you talk about how we're all sort of connected within 6 degrees.
Yeah,
you have this obviously very direct connection to Leo Strauss, and you wonder if Leo Strauss and Olivia Newton-John's grandfather on her mother's side ran in the same circles. I mean, it's very likely they knew each other. In some capacity, they likely knew each other and interacted at some point in their life.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Very, very likely did. So I'm not sure what else to say. I mean, she was. I loved her movies. I love Grease to this day. If I'm flipping through and Grease is on, I'll stop and watch it. And I know every word of every lyric of every song and that sort of stuff. So. It was some sad news, and I just wanted to pay a little tribute to Olivia Newton-John.
There's a lyric in particular, and I guess the whole movie. I'm still surprised to this day that Grease wasn't a victim of cancel culture, and it's sort of what it gets to the heart of how do these people decide what they want to go after and what they don't? If John Travolta is such a climate activist today, despite all of his private jets, and he's a pilot and he likes to fly around, he's such a climate activist. And you wonder if part of it is they like to protect their own. which is a little teaser into what we want to get into today. But they like to protect their own. Otherwise, I can't imagine how Grease has not been a victim of cancel culture to this day. And I say that because a few things. One, Grease, of all movies that we have ever had in the last 30, 40 years, 50 years, I guess it goes back 50 years, it is so definitional of gender roles, right? I mean, you have this clear definition of gender roles of the tough guys who like to work on cars and drive fast and be loose and crazy and wild. And then you've got the very prim and proper women and this interaction between the dangerous guy and the prim and proper girl and how they come together. The other thing is you talk about, I said, knowing every lyric. There's a line in one of those songs where they're talking about their first rendezvous, should we put it, their first time together, and the guys literally asked John Travolta, did she put up a fight? Like, it was normal commonplace for girls to put up a fight and still end up giving in and having said rendezvous.
Yeah. There's a whole lot of, maybe the question isn't why wasn't it canceled? Maybe it's just a question of when will it be canceled? Because I'm sure at some point, some activist is going to see that and be deeply offended. And probably the truth is a lot of it right now just boils down to a whole bunch of progressives today's progressives grew up watching and loving that movie. So they have this kind of, nostalgic attachment to it. And therefore they just turn their shoulder, turn their glance the other way.
I can guarantee, despite that, if John Travolta came out today and said the government went after Donald Trump yesterday and it was improper, they would immediately start trying to cancel every single movie he's ever been in.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure that's true. And that's kind of where we wanted to turn here. I mean, a very unusual thing has happened now. There is a little bit of a lag time between our recording of this podcast, and it has to be produced and edited and published. And that usually takes around 48 hours or so. So as of right now, as you and I are sitting here recording, very little is known other than the FBI did, in fact, conduct a raid on Trump's home. We know a few basic facts as of now. Apparently, there was a warrant for this raid. Apparently, they showed up sort of mid-morning, 10 o'clock, something like that, and they were there most of the afternoon into the evening when Trump was not there. Trump was gone. Trump was out of town. We did learn this morning that this is not the first time the FBI has been at Trump's Florida home. Apparently, they made a visit there several months ago in the spring. That was a different kind of situation. There was no warrant. There was no raid. And I believe that earlier time, Trump's lawyers were there talking to the FBI, and Trump himself might have been there. I don't know that. I don't know that for sure. But certainly, this kind of story is going to take off, and it has a lot of people alarmed, shocked. I mean, this is an unprecedented thing for the FBI, for a federal government investigatory agency to be knocking down the doors of a former president of the United States, and arguably potential candidate, probable candidate.
I think probable is probably the right word.
Yeah. There's a lot here. I mean, a lot of details are going to come out in the coming hours and days, and things that we don't know right now. There's going to be a lot of contrasts between Trump and Hillary, and contrast in those two, whatever. I don't know exactly what it is that Trump is alleged to have done. Apparently involves documents in boxes, and there are all kinds of federal laws and mountains of regulations about how these things are supposed to be handled and stored and secured and all these sort of things. But then there's also the interesting question, right, of how the FBI is treating Donald Trump in contrast to how the FBI treated Hillary Clinton. There was no raid on Hillary Clinton's residence or where she had her private servers operating. There was no raid because there was no warrant. There was no warrant because the FBI never went and asked to get such a warrant, even though there was all kinds of. I mean, the world sat and listened to James Comey in public testimony explain instance after instance of how Hillary Clinton had failed to secure top secret information and had exposed it to hacking and breaches of security and had taken steps to hide stuff. And after this exhaustive list of things and crimes she had committed, he turns around and says, and therefore we are suggesting no charges be pressed because she's Hillary Clinton and she's part of the administrative state.
Well, he actually went on to say that he didn't. He later clarified that he didn't want to press charges because he didn't want to have impact on an election.
Right.
Right. And placing that priority on having an election that wasn't controlled by the FBI, which is particularly interesting considering you brought it up earlier. He has talked. I mean, it is fairly clear at this point that Donald Trump is going to run for another term in office.
Right. And maybe that's why they decided to do this now before he makes an official announcement, because then politically that would be riskier, right? After he announces that he's running, then it really looks like the existing status quo government is going after a declared candidate. Right now, really all anyone can say is he's a probable candidate or a possible candidate. I mean, it's not official. Now, what we've talked about, Dave, so far, I mean, this is pretty stock. A lot of people are discussing these kinds of things. I wanted to offer sort of a bigger, deeper step back here just a little bit and provide some context and a view of these things. It's a little unusual view. It's a hypothesis that really has originated out of Claremont, which has sort of been my home base of education on these matters. And it has emerged from a group of scholars who've really spent their careers studying the creation, the development, the character of the bureaucratic state, the modern administrative state. And so I want to give kind of a historical perspective. And part of my thesis here is that modern scandals, really going back at least to and certainly to Watergate, that scandals, legal scandals, are now the new mode of politics. It is a form of politics by very entrenched partisan political people in the permanent government, the bureaucratic class. It's the way they fight back. And let me give here the sort of the historical context. So if you go all the way back to the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt, and the 1930s, the 1940s, this is the first actual creation of a large, sprawling administrative state, unelected bureaucrats who not only carry out public policy, but to a large extent shape public policy in the way that they form their regulations and the way that they administer their own bureaucracies. They are doing, to a large degree, they're shaping public policy, which under the old Constitution, right, that was supposed to be elected representatives were supposed to decide public policy based on voters, on the American people that they were representing. And so through the 30s and 40s, what happens is the creation of the size of the federal government grows exponentially. The Roosevelt administration, working with congressional New Deal Democrats, they expand many existing federal agencies and they create dozens, hundreds of new agencies, offices, bureaus that had never existed before. And through that period of the New Deal, the 30s and the 40s, how do I want to say this? The most focused political opposition was in the form of policy and program opposition. Republicans pushing back were arguing policy differences that this, what the government set this minimum wage at should be different. It should be higher or lower, or this tax rate, right, should be different than what it was. And those policy differences. There was no real political opposition to the administrative state itself. Nobody was challenging that. It was being created right in front of everyone. And I think for most Americans, it sort of caught them by surprise. I mean, no one really knew how to think about this. They had a very able political, let me say this, the administrative state in its inception in the New Deal had the benefit of a very able political class led by Franklin Roosevelt himself, reassuring the American people, right? This is all good for you. This is going to help you. This is how you're going to get jobs and food and all security in life. These are good things. It's really not until after World War II, after Franklin Roosevelt is dead, in the late 40s and the 1950s, when the administrative state itself becomes a topic of political dispute, right?
Sure.
That not everyone is just taking it for granted, and the organized political opposition to the degree that it existed was the Republican Party. And I say to the degree, what I mean by that is not all Republicans they still didn't really understand this phenomenon, how administration was very slowly and very subtly displacing and replacing electoral politics, the regular course of electoral politics.
Tom, I think it's important that people also realize in this, we've talked about divided electorates in the past, whether it was at the time of the revolution, where there were some people who said, we want a revolution. Some people just said, we want the status quo. And some people said, no, we want more control by England. You had during the Civil War and leading up to it, right? You had the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, and you had different people pulling in different directions. You're also talking about a time here, or just after a time here, as the administrative state was growing, where some of the key figures that Republicans looked to in that process were starting to really defend the idea of the administrative state. And I think that adds to the confusion. You look at Teddy Roosevelt, right? Yes. Teddy Roosevelt starts a new political party saying that Woodrow Wilson is insufficiently progressive.
Yes.
So if you're going to understand that, how does somebody who is a committed Republican at the time, who believed that Teddy Roosevelt during his day in office was a phenomenal president, is sitting there and now hearing somebody that they respected, that they trust, that they admire, telling them, no, progressivism is good. This isn't a Democrat idea. This is an American thing that we all need to embrace.
Yep. Dave, you're absolutely right. And in fact, it sort of prepares the way. I'm going to say some things here in just a moment about Richard Nixon. And I want to be clear that some of our listeners out there who are staunch constitutionalists and free marketeers, right? And they're going to say, well, to hell with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was just a progressive and he did all these things to expand government power. And that's true. That's true. But what I'm going to try to do is sort of explain Richard Nixon in the context of what did that look like to be a Republican trying to get elected to high office in the 1960s and the 1970s, and he had not devoted his life. He had not devoted his life to studying the Constitution, much less studying the administrative state, right?
Right.
And so I want to kind of put him in his time, not to excuse him or justify things, but just to help us understand how this comes about. And your point is absolutely right. So after World War II, in that period, the 1950s, 1960s, some Republicans, including prominent Republicans like Dwight Eisenhower, who's prominent enough to get elected president of the United States. He looks at this big, sprawling administrative state, and he thinks, well, the solution is to have the administrative state run by conservatives. have conservatives as president and have conservative, heads of various agencies. In other words, use the administrative state to implement conservative type of policies. And then you have others who are more sort of constitutionalists, libertarians, say, wait, the whole administrative state itself is a problem. We got to start repealing these things. And in this midst emerges Richard Nixon. And Nixon is such a fascinating character. And I think understanding Nixon helps us understand modern scandal-based politics all the way through Reagan, through Bush, through Trump. Nixon, on the one hand, there's a figure that looms large whenever we talk about the FBI. It's hard to have that discussion without mentioning J. Edgar Hoover, who was, he was head of the FBI for half a century. For 50 years. And he certainly did, to his credit, he transformed it from this tiny little organization whose powers were very unclear into this modern, sophisticated, very powerful part of the federal government. Now, he was also, Hoover was let me put it this way. Hoover loved scandals, and very quickly many presidents, this isn't just limited to Nixon, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, all these presidents, they came to realize that Hoover loves scandals. He loves dirt. He loves to dig up dirt and hold on to it. So Hoover was famous for having mountains of all kinds of salacious dirt, politicians having affairs and engaging in drugs, right? And doing all kinds of things that if it ever came to see the light of day, it would destroy the careers.
Right.
And what Hoover loved to do is sit on that and let everyone in the political class know, I have all this stuff. So when I ask for something, you better work with me and give me what I want, or I'm going to make your life a living hell. I'll run you out of office. Now,
I want to put before you go further, I want to put some things into context of what you just said. You talked about Hoover being the head of the FBI for a half of a century. Let's make sure everybody realizes this isn't like he was one in a string of FBI of heads of the FBI. The FBI as it exists today, called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as a formal entity, did not exist before Hoover. It was started in the early days of Hoover.
That's right.
It was a group of federal investigators before Hoover that existed, but they were not a formal bureau. The second thing is, when you talk about 50 years, the FBI, including how it existed before it was actually called the FBI, only started in 1908. So when you talk about he was the head of the FBI for over a century, he was the head of the FBI for half of its existence and the entire first half of its existence.
Right. From the 1920s through the 1970s, J. Edgar Hoover, he effectively is the FBI, and it raises enormous questions for the very concept of constitutional government, right? Because you have these three branches. Everyone remembers this from their civics class, right? And the branches are supposed to check each other and all this. And then there sits this agency that is effectively capable of blackmailing all three branches because it has been engaged in all kinds of often illegal, wiretapping and surveillance, and they have the dirt. I mean, John F. Kennedy once, what did he call? He used a phrase, something like the Gestapo, comparing the FBI to the German Nazi secret police. That like this is what the FBI seems to be becoming. And here I just wanted to point out sort of why it's hard to get your mind around a guy like Nixon, because Nixon was actually friendly with Hoover, liked Nixon. And now Hoover had political friends across the aisle, and he had political enemies across the. This was not a partisan thing. There were Republicans he liked. There were Republicans he hated. There were Democrats he liked. He loathed the Kennedy family. He despised the Kennedy family, who were Democrats, but he really liked Lyndon Johnson. He was willing to help Lyndon Johnson, right? So this was very much a personal thing with him, not a partisan thing.
Well, there's an area that all got started, and you talk about Hoover loving that sort of political game. He started. Remember the first real opportunity that Hoover had to get into the spotlight, where people started to really see who Hoover was, and where he became famous, was going after hidden communists in America. Right. Yeah. So you talk about Democrat, Republican, he's going after communists. And I think a lot of Republicans today, if they sat there and they said, oh, we've got an FBI agent, we've got the head of the FBI going after communists, saying, not in my country, this is not going to happen in my country. And how many of them would give him unlimited authority to say, go get those communists out of our country. And it sort of set him on this trail of getting away with a lot more than he was originally.
And you just put your finger on a big part of that. Was part of the friendship between Hoover and Nixon. Nixon emerged out of World War II as the onset of the Cold War in the 1940s. Nixon emerges as a staunch cold warrior. He is anti-communist. He thinks the Soviet Union is the great threat. He thinks Soviet communism is the great threat. And Hoover respects that about Nixon. Also, think of America in the 1960s, the rise of hippieism, for lack of a better term, Woodstock, right? The whole
free love,
free drugs, that kind of thing. And here's Nixon's talking about the importance of law and order. We've got rising crime in the cities, and we've got to crack down, right, and enforce the law. That's music to Hoover's ears, right? Hoover loves that idea of, we're going to crack down the law, and it's going to be us, the FBI. So I mention all this because here's where Nixon becomes important in this whole understanding our world today.
Mm-hmm.
Nixon was elected twice. When he was elected the first time in 1968, the dominating subject in America was the Vietnam War. You had to talk about Vietnam and offer, plans for Vietnam and promise some kind of victory and withdrawal from Vietnam. Like that was Nixon's whole focus. And that also meant lots of compromises with anybody in Congress who was willing to help you focus on Vietnam. And this is when Nixon is creating new agencies, and he's doing all kinds of progressive things. He's expanding the Office of Price and Wage Control in the White. I mean, think about it. These are bureaucrats who sit around and decide what business owners are going to pay for things and how much they're going to pay in salaries and wages and all of that. In 1972, it's almost like a different election. Nixon is the first president in modern history to make the administrative state a source of political dispute, going out in public, campaigning politically, saying our problem is this big sprawling administrative state. Now, if someone wants to say, well, he was a hypocrite, he was part of the problem. Yeah, he was. I don't think Nixon fully understood the very problem he was describing. He was right to call out the administrative state as a problem in a way similar to Donald Trump. Donald Trump campaigned against the swamp and this growing bureaucratic class. I don't think either of those guys really understand the depths and the theoretical basis, the justification, the extent of the power of the administrative state. But Nixon was the first to say that thing there, that's a problem. And the administrative state, this is one of the great lessons to teach Americans today. The administrative state, the bureaucratic class, they have interests. They have political interests. They want to secure their position, their power, their privilege. And so for them, they don't want their own agencies to be part of political dispute. They want the political class to be disputing things like, what should the minimum wage be? Should it be this or should it be this? Or what should the tax rate? Politicians, the political class, they can debate those things, and then the permanent bureaucratic class will go implement them. What they don't want is the bureaucratic class itself to be the subject of political dispute. And Nixon did that. And I think that's what Watergate was ultimately about, is the bureaucratic class pushing back. You know, it's funny. There are these reporters from the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein. And for years, this was this great mystery. They were the ones who broke the story, and they had all this information, this confidential information coming from the White House. And they always cited it as Deep Throat. Deep Throat was this anonymous source, and those reporters, they were heralded. They got all kinds of awards as doing this groundbreaking investigation. The truth is, and here's part of my presentation that's a little unusual, I'm actually not that impressed with those guys, because I don't think they did any real in-depth investigating. What they did is they were being fed information by members of the bureaucratic class. I mean, years later, it came out who Deep Throat was. Deep Throat was a high-level FBI agent who was handing them confidential, secret information, and then they were trickling it out. They were building the case against the president. And here's where this, I said in the beginning how scandal really is kind of the new mode of politics. It's the new mode of politics when the politics involves the administrative state. Any government, this is true for our government, and any government anywhere is always going to attract, number one, people who want to profit personally off of government largesse. Every government's going to attract those types. And every government is going to attract people who want to abuse their power. I mean, that's just the nature of government. That's what government attracts. Add that to mountains of regulations about how everyone in the various branches are supposed to be conducting their business. And what you end up with is the fact that in any administration, at any given time, there are all kinds of laws being broken, all kinds of regulations being broken. That provides the administrative state, the bureaucratic class, with weapons that they can sit on and they can use to bully and blackmail and push around members of the political class. And more importantly, if anyone in the political class turns onto the bureaucracy, starts attacking the bureaucracy, saying the bureaucracy is the problem, that's how the bureaucracy fights back. Well, now we're going to come out and charge you with a crime because we have evidence that these laws, these regulations, the way we decide you're going to run your office. I mean, think of this stuff. This is like this case with Trump right now. This involves the National Archives. The National Archives.
Right.
Imagine just on the face of that, how strange that is that the unelected bureaucrats are going to tell an elected constitutional president of the United States, here's how you're going to exercise the executive power. The last time I read the Constitution, Dave, it says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. And there's a period. It doesn't say, and bureaucrats in the National Archives who will tell the president, how he's going to run his office. And so you see this with Watergate as kind of the prime model, and it gets repeated in the Reagan administration. It gets repeated in the Bush administration. Anytime members of the political class, and for the most part, what this means are Republicans. When Republicans show the courage to challenge the bureaucracy, to come out in public and say, I think our problem is the bureaucracy itself, the bureaucracy strikes back. And the way they strike back is with a scandal. You can guarantee it. And so here we have this guy in Trump who sort of made the most clear, obvious challenge of the bureaucracy of anybody in recent history, really anyone going back at least to Reagan or not to Nixon himself. And so I encourage people to think about this replacement of what used to be political powers. The old way under the Constitution was you had these three branches. Each branch had its own powers. Each branch had its own interests. And the whole idea of separation of powers was each branch is using those powers and those interests, pursuing and pushing back against the others. And those others are pushing back, right? And they're all kind of pushing against each other so that no one branch should dominate the whole thing. That was the old model. Now, and if there was ever a question, I mean, the Constitution does grant to Congress the power of impeachment. If there was some huge problem with somebody who's in the government, well, then impeach them. And the impeachment is supposed to be a highly political, public process. Make the case. If whether it's a president or anyone else in the government, if you think they should be impeached, make the case why they should be impeached. And of course, that person being impeached is probably going to make their case why they should not be impeached. And the American people should sit and watch and be the ultimate judges, whether they think there should be impeachment or not. It's a very political process. One of our challenges today, I think, is to recover the older meaning of that word politics or political. I think it has come to mean for many Americans, when they hear that as an adjective, that something's political, they assume, well, that just means lies and cheating and right. And it certainly, politics includes that. Politics includes lies and cheating and bribes and corruption and all that. But there's a higher, nobler sense of the word political. I mean, to be a self-governing people is a political act. For a nation of people to say, we're going to govern ourselves. We are going to decide what powers our government has. We're going to judge whether those in government do a good job or not. Those are all political activities, political actions. And it was supposed to be the American people exercising political oversight over their government through impeachment, through elections, through ordinary constitutional means. What has happened since Watergate, increasingly our political disputes, when they involve the administrative state, now take the form of a legal scandal. Did this politician violate this regulation or violate this law? That's not a political matter for us to discuss as citizens. That depends now on investigators and lawyers and special prosecutors and independent counsels, right? You got to go. It's just like at a criminal trial, right? You don't make a political either attack or defense of someone in a trial. You wait and see. You got to wait. What's the evidence and what do the lawyers say and what does the judge say, right? That's a legal question. And this is part of the way the administrative state defends itself and attacks enemies, is to turn political opposition. If you have a sitting president or a former president or someone who's a political candidate who is challenging, who's attacking the administrative state itself, the administrative state attacks back by launching a scandal and saying, we have 1 million regulations and 1,000 laws, and you betcha we can find someone close to you or you yourself have violated them, and we're going to charge you with a crime. And it makes it really hard to muster a political defense. One of the great commentators on this, I'll throw out a name. He's relatively unknown, but his name is John Marini, and he's really done more work to unpack and uncover the modern administrative state than anyone. And he noticed, he was a young man when Watergate was going on. And one of the things he saw was that as Watergate was unfolding, there was enormous organized political attacks on Nixon, but there was almost no political organized defense of Nixon. And yet, this is a guy who was popular enough to get elected president twice. I mean, there were tens of millions of Americans like Nixon, voted for Nixon. Where was the Republican Party? Where were all these Republican organizations? And what Marini noticed, he said, once the question becomes not a political question, but it becomes a legal question, or it becomes a question of compliance, right? Did they violate a regulation? Did they violate a law? It makes it really difficult, almost impossible to muster a political defense when the question has been reduced down to a legal question. And so, that was Marini talking about Watergate in 1972. And here we are in 2022, and we're watching the exact same thing now unfold. What are the kind of questions that are going to come out of this? They won't be political questions. They'll be, well, what regulations are there about papers that were in the White House? And, did Trump or someone else put it in this kind of box or that kind of box? Does that violate the regulation or the law, right? Or does it becomes a legal question for bureaucrats in the administrative state to decide?
There's so many things to jump in on that. But what you're talking about is really this question of, does the idea that a president breaks a regulation that has become a law, right? I mean, all of these things are regulations created by bureaucrats that are now laws, right? Congress didn't go and pass some act that says the president has to turn over everything to the National Archives, unless I'm wrong on that.
In fact, they passed a law in the late 1970s. In fact, right around when Greece was coming out, 77, 78, there's a reorganization act that's passed, and it does create a lot of the rules. It also created the independent counsel. It's the law that creates the independent counsel now, and also it authorizes the National Archives, right, to make regulations to decide how to handle communications and these sort of things.
But that's my point, right? It authorized the National Archives to make a regulation that has the effect of law.
Yes.
They didn't go in and say, we have the National Archives and we are going to pass a law because that's what our constituents want, is a law that says the National Archives is going to maintain all of these documents. Yeah. At some point, you have these you kind of said it in what you were talking about, this depth of laws that it's almost impossible for anybody to know all of the laws to the point that they're not breaking something at some time, or many things all the time. And because of that, these presidents, the entire idea here is to get them in a situation and then convince the American public that if a president breaks a regulation, violates a regulation that has the effect of law, they should be thrown out of office. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Right.
If Donald Trump violates this law, he should be punished to the fullest extent of the law, fullest extent possible.
Right.
Because the National Archives said so, and all because the Congress gave them that power. The question becomes here, I'm going to suggest, and I want to take your hypothesis and put a little bit of my own spin on it. The question I would suggest is the problem here is, have we gotten so far away from, or I would say actually we have gotten so far away from the idea of elections are about Democrat versus Republican versus third parties. It no longer matters. We have our elected government and we have our permanent government. And one thing you didn't get into that you've talked about a lot in the past and is in a lot of our seminars and things like that is these old ideas that started as early as the late 1800s in progressivism of the need for a permanent state, a permanent government that can't be violated, that can continue to make sure things operate, even though a president comes in every 4 or 8 years, even though congressmen come in every 2 years and senators come in every 6 years. They didn't believe in the design of the country that the founders outlined. And instead, they said, no, we need a permanent government. We need these bureaucracies to run everything consistently and get us to that point of equality and the things that they felt like human beings were incapable of achieving on their own. And that's the big debate that we're actually posing here is, can human beings achieve equality, justice, and the like in a free state versus a controlled, centrally planned government?
Yeah, and I think here's sort of one of the big takeaways I'm trying to get at. In the modern progressive administrative state in which we live, when you look at the scandals that run from Nixon and Watergate through, Reagan and Iran-Contra, through the Bush presidency, through Trump himself, the whole Mueller investigation, right, and all of that. You look at that, what's been going on for the last half century.
Mm-hmm.
The bureaucratic class is sending a message. And what they're saying to the political class, to the elected class, is they're saying, you can discuss and debate anything you want, but not us. You don't debate, you don't question the bureaucratic class itself. This is not a proper topic for political dispute. And so what that does is, right, it really cuts the legs off of any kind of meaningful constitutional conservatism. If we want to go out and make the case that we think the biggest problem today isn't the climate, and it's not minimum wage is the wrong number. No. The biggest problem today is this gigantic unconstitutional administrative state that runs every aspect of our lives. Like we have to start getting rid of that. Those bureaucrats are not going to sit there and listen to that kind of political talk and do nothing. They're going to do something.
Right.
But they're bureaucrats. They're part of the permanent government. So when they respond, they're not going to respond in the normal political. They're not going to send out flyers, right? They're not going to send out, say, we're members of the IRS and we hate Donald Trump. Don't vote for him, right? They're not going to publish op-eds in newspapers. What they're going to do is make a call to Woodward and Bernstein and say, hey, buddy, we got dirt on this guy. You want to make this guy's life a living hell? And you start leaking that to the media. You let the media do the work of building a case against whatever politician is attacking the bureaucracy, and you destroy the politician. It is a way for the bureaucracy to defend itself and entrench its power and its interests.
I'm going to suggest they could do even worse. And what I mean by that is they might not just call and say, hey, do you want to get rid of this guy? It's, hey, you're going to get rid of this guy. And not only do we have dirt on him, we have dirt on you.
Yeah.
And you can either go after him, or we can leak to somebody else what you're doing wrong. And the best example of this is Christopher Wray, who's the current director of the FBI. Right. Yeah. Christopher Wray was a Donald Trump appointee. Christopher Wray was part of the Republican. He was a Republican. He was a Republican advocate. He was liked by Donald Trump and many of those around him. And now he's sitting there doing things like this, like the raid on Trump's house. And you sit there and you wonder what was said and what happened. And you talk about leaks to the media. Let's not forget that it was in late in Donald Trump's term, and I'm trying to remember exactly when, but late in Donald Trump's term is Christopher Wray leaking information, later admitting to leaking information to the Wall Street Journal, from the FBI about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And it makes you sit back and wonder, all of the things that I have sat and said, I'm frustrated with Donald Trump for not accomplishing A, B, C, and D.
Yeah.
You wonder how many threats he had behind closed doors. You wonder how many threats are being made. And this gets back to that hypothesis that I was going for, which is it is no longer Democrat versus Republican. You have this infighting between Democrats and Republicans, and the deep state, the permanent government, the swamp, whatever you want to call it, they like that because it keeps people fighting with each other and leaving them alone.
Let me put this in a slightly different way. Under the original design of the Constitution, the idea was you have the government, people who actually get elected to government, and then you have this big arena underneath, this big political arena, the arena of politics, self-governing politics, and it's citizens talking and debating about all kinds of political subjects. Should we go to war? Should we not go to war? Should we those kinds of things? And with the political realm, these were citizens who would choose who to elect to send up to the government. The government itself wasn't supposed to be involved in the politics. The government itself isn't supposed to be one of the players in the political arena. And my point is, when you create a gigantic administrative state, the government itself not only becomes a player in politics, it becomes the dominant player. It becomes who had more influence for 2 years in Trump's administration? What citizens had more influence than Robert Mueller? And who's Robert Mueller? He's part of the permanent government. He's part of the bureaucratic class there to defend the interests of the bureaucracy. And I'm suggesting this is a huge problem. This is turning the idea of self-government onto its head. It's turning it upside down when this gigantic permanent bureaucratic class develops its own political interests and advances them through scandals and other kinds of means.
Well, remember, it wasn't just Robert Mueller who had ultimate power for years. I mean, you look at Fauci. I mean, Fauci is another member of that bureaucratic permanent government that controlled our lives for 2 years. I mean, you could make a list an hour long of all of the people just during the Trump years that had bureaucratic control over our lives. And I think to that.
And here is this is an insight that is so penetrating and so deep and so important, and yes, missed so often. I mentioned John Marini. He operates within the realm of academic political science and really has been a pioneer in these studies. In the realm of economics, there's a whole school of thought called public choice, which is very similarly related. It's looking at how government institutions create incentives and disincentives. And this is part of Marini's lesson that I'm trying to convey. This isn't a personality problem. It's not that Anthony Fauci is a bad guy or Robert Mueller. I mean, maybe they are bad guys, but you could replace them with anybody. And the problem is not those individuals. The problem is the structure. You create an enormous bureaucratic class that creates interest in preserving the bureaucracy. And now when anybody outside the bureaucracy says, man, we think the bureaucracy is the problem. We think we got to start getting, bureaucracy is going to fight back. Now you have the bureaucracy as a political actor, but they're engaging in very unorthodox politics, very, unusual, non-traditional type of politics. They're not politicking in the same way Republican groups politic and Democrat groups, right? They're not doing that. They're politicking in the way Deep Throat was politicking.
Well, so to that end, and to sort of wrap this whole thing up, I want to suggest a change in the frame of mindset for our members and for all Americans. The fight, I have heard so many times that this is about Democrat versus Republican. Now, don't get me wrong. There is a huge preference on the left for Democrats to preserve the bureaucratic state. There's also a huge number of Republicans, and there have been for years, who have interests in preserving the bureaucratic permanent government. This is not a fight of Democrat versus Republican. And the more we keep making it about that, the more you keep allowing the permanent government off the hook. The only way we get...
I agree with you, Dave. This is like a dream for me. This is my dream come true, is for growing numbers of Americans to stop thinking in terms of Republican versus Democrat. Stop thinking, I hate Trump, I hate Hillary, I hate Joe Biden, and start thinking in terms of the alternatives of political self-government. We, the people, choose how we're going to live, and we make the ultimate decisions, or bureaucratic control over those really are our options. And that's what it all comes down to. And here in this case regarding Donald Trump, is he going to run again? Is he going to get elected? That question should be decided by Donald Trump and the American people. And that's it. It should not be decided by 3 unelected bureaucrats at the National Archives. That they should not be the ones deciding who runs for president and who does. We, the people, should make those choices. That's what self-government means.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the idea here is it needs to become America versus the permanent government, no longer Republican versus Democrat. If you want to say I hate Joe Biden, look, I am not a fan of Joe Biden. I'm not a fan of Joe Biden, not because I think he's going after Donald Trump. I'm upset with Joe Biden because I think he defends the permanent government. Yeah. He wants to expand the permanent government. He wants to give further power and control to the permanent government. And that's what makes him so dangerous. It has nothing to do with whether or not he's going after Trump or not. Why? Because it doesn't matter if it's Trump or somebody else. They are always going to go after anybody who's trying to push back. And the only way to prevent that is for huge numbers of people to start standing up and saying, we're not going to have it anymore. Yeah. We're not going to allow the permanent government to run our lives anymore. This is not acceptable.
You're certainly correct. I was just going to sort of give a more current day political perspective on this. I mean, we were talking all this history going all the way back to the 30s and 40s. Right now, Joe Biden and his Democratic allies in Congress, they're passing another legislative monstrosity, big they're going to spend lots of other people's money. And think of all the things all the challenges you have in your life. Our listeners, think of all the problems we have. Prices are going through the roof. There's shortages of everything. Like, life is really hard right now, and it's going to get harder. And you know what Joe Biden and his Democratic friends are doing? They're adding 80,000 agents to the IRS. Talk about adding to the power, right, of the permanent bureaucratic class. Now, when they do that, when they say we're going to give you the bureaucrats, we're going to give you more power, more resources, we're going to add to everything you have. You think the IRS is going to be leaking any scandals about the Biden administration? Nope. If you send the message to the bureaucratic class that we're willing to help you, then the bureaucratic class leaves you alone. If you stand up in public and say, I'm going after the bureaucratic class, they will come after you and likely destroy you. If you're Richard Nixon, they will knock you out of office.
And they left him alone. As long as he was promoting them and building them up and defending them, they left him alone. Yep. The minute he stopped, it was over. And the further proof of this, I think, just to wrap a bow on exactly what you're saying, every single Republican president since Eisenhower has gone through an impeachment hearing.
Yeah.
Every single Republican president since Eisenhower has faced impeachment hearings. Yeah. Those aren't coming just because Democrats say, oh, we don't like you and we want to decide should you be president anymore. Yeah. They didn't want to wait for people to vote and decide should you be president anymore. This was the permanent government coming in and saying, we're giving you a scandal because this is not okay and we don't want you here anymore.
Yep, that's right. And in that sense, in that way, I want people to reflect on what this means. It means that Congress and the media both really become agents of the permanent bureaucratic class. The permanent bureaucratic class becomes the principals, and then they use Congress. They leak scandals to Congress and say, you better go impeach that president. Or they leak scandals to their friends in the media. You better go create a public campaign, a political campaign against this sitting president. And that's not the way of constitutional self-government. That's something very, very different. That's a Soviet form of politics. That's not a self-governing American form of politics.
Which is why we've said we are more Soviet and German today than we are American. Yeah. And this is the first line that has to be defeated if we're going to reclaim the ideas of the American founding. And with that, if anybody really does believe in our purpose here, anybody listening really does believe in our purpose here, you need to stop thinking about this purely as Republican versus Democrat. You need to start thinking about this as American versus the permanent government, a self-governing republic versus a permanent government. That's the way we guard the American idea.
Nos sumos custodes.